Around 3,000 years ago, long before the world feels familiar, in any modern sense, you find yourself at the edge of a forgotten city that once lived and breathed in the ancient world of 1000 BCE. The air is still cool, almost hesitant, as if the morning itself is unsure whether to fully arrive. Ahead of you, mud brick walls rise from the earth like quiet memories pressed into form, softened by wind and time. There are no crowds yet, no noise of commerce or ceremony, only the faint creak of wood somewhere distant, and the slow pulse of waking life. Your mind drifts as your eyes adjust to shapes forming out of shadow. A narrow street stretches forward its surface, uneven, worn by countless footsteps that no longer exist. You can almost feel the texture beneath your feet, dusty, slightly warm, carrying the weight of generations. Somewhere, beyond the walls, a bird calls sharp and brief, breaking the stillness like a whispered reminder that this place is not entirely asleep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you are listening from somewhere in the world right now, feel free to share your location and what time it is where you are. There is something oddly comforting about imagining all of us drifting through time together like this. Now dim the lights, you step forward into the city, and the first thing that greets you is not people, but structure. Records confirm that cities of this era were often built with deliberate planning, walls and gates designed not just for protection, but for identity. Yet oddly enough, archaeologists have found asymmetries in layouts that suggest improvisation rather than pure design, as if the city grew the way a thought does, slowly and unevenly. Scholars still argue whether these settlements were centrally planned by rulers or shaped gradually by families, building where space allowed. The mud brick walls on either side feel close, almost protective, their surfaces rough under your imagined touch. You run your fingers along them and notice impressions of straw and clay materials mixed with care, but also necessity. There is a faint scent here, something earthy and dry, like sun-baked soil after rain. It clings to everything, to air, to memory, to time itself. As you walk deeper, the city begins to breathe around you. A distant door opens. A pot clinks softly. Somewhere, a fire is being coaxed back to life. You are not alone anymore, though you still see very few people. The early hours belong to preparation, not performance. Life here does not begin loudly. It unfolds. A curious footnote from excavations reveals that some of these early cities contained surprisingly standardized brick sizes, suggesting shared knowledge across regions. That detail alone hints at communication networks far wider than one might expect for such an ancient time, and yet no agreement has been reached on whether this standardization came from political authority or simple cultural imitation spreading from town to town. You pass what might become a main road later in the day. For now, it is empty, except for faint wheel grooves pressed into dust. You imagine carts arriving soon, voices rising, trade beginning its familiar rhythm. But in this moment, everything feels suspended, as if the city is holding its breath. Ahead, a shape begins to emerge through the haze of morning light. The central cluster of buildings slightly taller, slightly more deliberate. This is where your journey truly begins, where daily life gathers itself from silence into motion. You continue forward, and the forgotten city slowly opens its eyes around you. You move deeper into the waking city, and the silence from before begins to fracture into small, subtle sounds. A door scraping open, a rope tightening, the soft shuffle of someone deciding that the day has officially started. Above you, the early light strengthens, spilling across the mud-brick walls in warm, uneven patches that make the entire place feel like it is slowly remembering itself. Your steps carry you along a narrow corridor between buildings where the air is cooler, trapped overnight between dense structures. You can almost feel the city's boundaries pressed in, not in a threatening way, but in a way that suggests closeness, familiarity, shared survival. Records confirm that cities of this era often clustered, tightly conserving space and heat, a practical decision shaped by climate and security. And yet, oddly enough, some excavations show occasional wide-open courtyards that seem almost unnecessary, leaving scholars still arguing over whether they were ceremonial, social, or simply leftover space no one knew how to use. As you walk, your hand brushes against the wall again, and this time you notice something different. Slight variations in the brickwork, a seam where repairs were made, layers upon layers of human effort sticked and adjusted over time. It feels less like a wall and more like a living record. Ahead, the shape of a gate begins to form. Not grand, but functional, a controlled passage between inside and outside. You can imagine guards stationed here earlier in the night, though no one is present now. Archaeological records confirm that many such cities maintained gate systems for taxation and security, but scholars still bicker over how strictly these rules were enforced in daily life. Was movement tightly controlled, or more flexible than official systems suggest? You pause near the threshold. The air changes slightly here, carrying faint traces of something metallic, maybe from tools or hinges, mixed with the ever-present scent of baked earth. Beyond the gate, the land opens into a transitional space where trade, agriculture, and outside travel begin to intersect with city life. A curious footnote from excavation layers suggests that some gates had decorative markings, symbols that may have indicated family groups or administrative districts. Oddly enough, similar symbols appear in distant settlements, hinting at shared cultural patterns that spread without clear political control. You step through. The city does not end here. Instead, it expands outward into a more open district where movement becomes less constrained. The density of buildings thins, replaced by workshops and storage spaces. The soundscape shifts too. You hear a distant hammer strike rhythmic and steady, a pot rolling across packed earth, a low murmur of early bargaining. Your attention is drawn to a larger structure ahead, taller walls, a more defined entrance. This is not a home, and not quite a market either. It feels like something in between, a space where decisions are made and goods are gathered. Records confirm that early urban centers often combined administrative and economic functions in shared spaces, though no agreement has been reached on how formal these institutions truly were. You approach slowly, noticing small details now. Rope marks on wooden beams, clay seals broken and reformed, the residue of organization trying to hold everything together. And still the city feels like it is only partially awake, as if you have arrived before the story fully begins. The open space ahead finally resolves into what must have been the city's early market district, though calling it a market feels almost too modern too structured for what you are seeing. Instead, it is a loose gathering of surfaces, platforms, and worn pathways where exchange will soon happen, but at this hour still lingers in anticipation. Your presence feels strangely out of place here, as if you have arrived before the script of the day has been handed out. The ground is uneven, compacted by countless previous movements, yet now resting in a temporary pause. A broken clay scale lies near a low platform half buried in dust. Nearby, small round tokens made of baked clay are scattered in a shallow container, their purpose not immediately obvious, but clearly intentional. Records confirm that early urban economies often relied on standardized weights and token systems for trade, especially in regions where writing was still developing. Yet, oddly enough, some excavations reveal overlapping systems within the same city, suggesting that no single method dominated completely. Scholars still argue whether this reflects economic experimentation or competing groups with their own traditions of exchange. You step closer to one of the platforms. It is simple, constructed from stone and hardened earth. You imagine it covered with woven mats or goods by midday. Right now, it feels like a stage before actors arrive. A faint scent of stored grain drifts through the air, dry and slightly sweet, as if something was recently moved or opened. Your attention follows the scent toward a nearby structure with sealed jars stacked carefully inside. Some are marked with impressions pressed into clay lids, symbols whose meanings are still debated. A curious footnote from excavation studies suggests that certain markings may have functioned more like branding than administration, an early form of identifying origin or ownership. Movement begins slowly around you. A figure appears at the edge of the space, then another. Not many yet, but enough to signal transition. The city is shifting from preparation to interaction. You notice how sound behaves differently here. Voices carry farther in open areas, even when quiet. A distant call echoes between structures, though the words are indistinct. It might be coordination or simple greeting. No agreement has been reached on how formalized early market language truly was and whether trade was conducted through structured negotiation or more informal social exchange. Your eyes drift across the space again. You notice grooves in the earth where heavier objects were dragged, possibly storage jars, possibly grain sacks, possibly something else entirely. Archaeologists still debate how much of this activity was centralized versus household-based production brought into shared spaces. A strange detail catches your attention near one corner, a cluster of broken pottery arranged almost deliberately, not like trash, but like placement. Some researchers suggest such arrangements may have had ritual significance, while others argue they are simply the result of repeated use and disposal patterns over time. The market space is no longer empty. It is assembling itself. You continue forward, aware that by mid-morning this place will transform completely. Voices will overlap. Goods will be exchanged. Decisions will be made quickly, almost instinctively, shaped by need rather than formality. But for now, you are still early enough to see the structure behind the activity. You linger just a little longer in the half-awake market district, and now the city begins to change its tone. What was once quiet anticipation starts to gather warmth and motion. A thin column of smoke curls upward from somewhere nearby, drifting lazily across the open space before dissolving into the pale sky. The scent reaches you A moment later, soft and familiar wood and grain, and something faintly charred. Your attention follows the smoke into a narrower alley where early fires are being coaxed into life. Not roaring flames, but careful beginnings. Records confirm that most households and workshops in cities of this era relied on controlled hearths for cooking and heating, often shared among family groups or small clusters of homes. Yet, oddly enough, some excavation sites show evidence of experimental pit designs that may have improved fuel efficiency, though scholars still argue whether this was innovation or simple adaptation to scarce resources. You step closer, and the warmth of the imagined fire seems to reach you. There is a tactile shift in the air here, as if heat itself changes the texture of space. The alley walls feel closer again, absorbing sound and light. You hear the soft crackle of burning wood, the faint clink of pottery being moved, the rustle of someone preparing something unseen. A figure passes briefly at the edge of your awareness, carrying a bundle of grain or fuel you cannot be sure. Movement here is efficient, purposeful, nothing wasted. Even early mornings carry intention. A curious footnote from archaeological findings suggests that some urban households organized shared cooking schedules, rotating fire use to conserve fuel. This detail hints at a level of coordination that feels surprisingly modern, though no agreement has been reached on whether this was formalized rule or simply social habit evolving over time. You notice how the smoke behaves differently in enclosed spaces. It lingers longer, clinging to surfaces, leaving behind faint traces on ceilings and door frames. Over time, this would have shaped the color of interiors, darkening them gradually, a visual record of countless mornings just like this one. As you move through the alley, you pass an opening into a small courtyard. Here, early preparation is underway. Grain is being measured. Water is being poured into clay vessels. Someone kneels briefly near the hearth, adjusting embers with practiced care. The gestures are quiet, almost meditative. Records confirm that staple foods in many ancient urban centers were grain-based, often barley or wheat, depending on region and climate. Yet oddly enough, botanical remains suggest occasional inclusion of wild herbs and seeds that were not strictly cultivated, raising questions about dietary flexibility versus necessity. Scholars still debate whether this reflects scarcity or cultural preference. You pause again, observing how fire transforms everything around it. Not just food, but time. The day is no longer suspended. It has direction now. The alley behind you begins to fill with faint movement as others wake and follow similar routines. The city is no longer holding its breath. It is breathing, and you continue forward deeper into the rhythm of early life unfolding around you. You leave the smoke-filled alley behind, but the scent of fire clings to you as you step back into the broader flow of the city. The morning has fully shifted now. What felt like hesitation earlier has become motion, slow but steady, like a great organism remembering how to function. Ahead, the buildings change again. The market district softens into residential space, and you find yourself walking along a narrower passage where homes press close on either side. Mud brick walls rise in uneven rhythm, some freshly repaired, others weathered and softened by time. You reach out and brush one with your imagined hand, noticing how the surface crumbles slightly under pressure, like something both sturdy and fragile at once. Records confirm that domestic architecture in cities of this era often consisted of multi-room dwellings organized around central courtyards. These spaces were designed for both privacy and shared family life, though oddly enough, excavation patterns sometimes show variations that suggest wealthier households may have adopted more compartmentalized layouts earlier than expected. Scholars still argue over whether this indicates social stratification or simply regional preference. You step into one such home through an open threshold. There is no door in the modern sense, just an opening framed by wood and clay. Inside, the air feels cooler, shaded from the rising sun. The courtyard is modest, a central open space where light gathers softly, illuminating worn surfaces and scattered household tools. A clay jar sits near one corner, its rim smoothed by repeated use. Nearby, a grinding stone rests on the ground, its surface etched with years of grain processing. You can almost hear the repetitive motion that shaped it, the quiet labor that sustained entire households. A curious footnote from excavation findings suggests that some homes contained hidden storage pits beneath floors, used for preserving grain or valuables. These features were sometimes carefully concealed, leading scholars to debate whether they were security measures or part of ritual household practices tied to protection and prosperity. You move deeper into the space, and your attention is drawn to the subtle layering of life here. Ash stains mark one wall where a hearth once burned. Repairs overlap older repairs. Nothing is truly static. Everything is adjusted, reused, rebuilt. In one corner, faint impressions in clay hint at textile work, perhaps weaving or rope-making. Records confirm that textile production was often a domestic responsibility frequently managed within household spaces rather than centralized workshops. Yet, oddly enough, some sites show evidence of standardized patterns across regions, suggesting shared knowledge or long-distance cultural exchange. No agreement has been reached on how such uniformity spread so widely. You pause in the center of the courtyard. The space feels both enclosed and open at the same time, like a world within a world. Above you, the sky is visible in a narrow frame, bright and indifferent. From somewhere deeper in the home you hear movement, not rushed but deliberate. Someone going about their morning tasks unaware of your presence. The city outside continues to hum, but here inside this small domestic universe, life feels slower, more contained. Every object tells a story of repetition, of care, of necessity, shaped into routine. And as you stand there, you begin to understand that this forgotten city is not defined only by its walls or markets, but by these quiet interiors where most of life actually unfolds. You step back out from the quiet courtyard, and the city greets you with a slightly different rhythm now. The morning has advanced, and with it comes a growing sense of coordination, as if invisible threads are tightening between homes, workshops, and shared spaces. Voices are still low, but more frequent. Movement is more confident. The day is no longer forming, it is established. You follow a narrow path that slopes gently downward, and soon the sound of water reaches you. At first, it is subtle, a distant trickle, then clearer, more deliberate. The path opens into a communal water point, where several clay-lined basins and shallow wells collect and distribute the city's most essential resource. Records confirm that many early urban settlements developed structured water management systems, including wells, cisterns, and sometimes rudimentary canal networks. These systems were vital for survival, especially in regions with seasonal rainfall. Yet, oddly enough, some excavation layers reveal overlapping water channels that do not appear to align with a single master plan, leading scholars to debate whether water distribution was centrally controlled or managed by smaller neighborhood groups. You approach the nearest basin. The surface of the water is still reflecting the pale morning sky in a distorted, trembling mirror. Around it, faint grooves in the ground show where countless feet have passed, carrying jars, bowls, and vessels of every size. You can almost feel the repetition of daily life embedded into the earth itself. A figure appears at the edge of your awareness, kneeling to fill a container. The movement is practiced, efficient, almost automatic. Another follows shortly after then. Another. There is no rush, but there is structure. People understand their place in the flow. A curious footnote from archaeological study suggests that some water sites contained small stone markers or boundary indicators possibly used to organize usage times or prevent overcrowding. However, no agreement has been reached on whether these were formal regulations or informal community agreements that evolved organically over time. You notice the sound here is different from the market or residential areas. It is quieter but more layered. The splash of water, the scrape of pottery against stone, the occasional soft exchange of words. Everything feels measured, as if even speech adapts to the importance of the resource. You kneel, or at least imagine yourself doing so, and look more closely at the basin's edge. The clay lining shows where small chips and repairs indicating long-term use. Records confirm that water infrastructure in ancient cities often required continuous maintenance, sometimes performed collectively by residents or assigned groups. Yet oddly enough, some sites show sudden shifts in construction style, suggesting changes in authority or knowledge transfer that scholars still argue about. As you rise, you notice the wider system beyond this single basin. Paths branch outward, each likely leading to other collection points or distribution areas. The city is quietly mapped by necessity, shaped by the simple requirement of survival. A soft breeze passes through, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and early vegetation from beyond the city walls. For a brief moment, the boundary between built environment and natural landscape feels thin, almost negotiable. You continue along the path, leaving the water site behind, but the impression remains. Life here is not just built on structures, but on coordination, on shared timing, on invisible agreements that keep everything functioning without needing constant explanation. And as you move forward, you begin to sense how deeply water, something so ordinary, quietly defines the shape of the entire city. You leave the water point behind, and the city begins to narrow again, pulling you back into tighter corridors, where sound softens and movement becomes more intimate. The rhythm of the morning has fully settled now. You notice how people no longer move as if they are preparing for the day, but as if they are already inside it, fully embedded in its demands. Ahead, the passage opens slightly into a small residential cluster, and here the scale of life shifts downward again. Lower walls, smaller doorways, more frequent glimpses of daily domestic routines. You catch sight of children moving through the alley, their presence sudden and light, like quick flashes of motion between heavier, slower adult activity. They are not idle. Even in play there is structure. A group gathers near a patch of packed earth, shaping small objects from clay and dust. Simple forms, figurines, miniature vessels. Records confirm that children in many ancient urban societies engaged in imitative play that mirrored adult labor, suggesting early exposure to economic and domestic roles. Yet oddly enough, some excavation layers reveal objects that appear intentionally crafted as toys, rather than practiced tools, leading scholars still to argue whether childhood was seen as separate from work or deeply intertwined with it. You pause watching them from a distance. Their voices are faint, overlapping quickly, changing direction. There is no central authority to their movement, yet there is coordination, almost instinctive. One child passes a small object to another who reshapes it without hesitation. A curious footnote from archaeological finds suggests that miniature clay objects were sometimes found in domestic waste layers, not ceremonial spaces, indicating everyday use rather than ritual intent. However, no agreement has been reached on whether these items were purely recreational or part of informal education within households. You continue walking slowly through the alley, noticing how the environment adapts to its youngest inhabitants. Low ledges for sitting, open patches of ground that feel deliberately left empty, slight variations in surface texture that make movement easier for smaller feet. The city, in its own quiet way, accommodates multiple scales of life simultaneously. A distant sound draws your attention, a rhythmic tapping perhaps from a workshop nearby. But here it is softer, partially absorbed by walls and earth. The children briefly pause, then resume their activity unconcerned. Their world and the adult world overlap without sharp division. Records confirm that urban households often integrated children into daily tasks, gradually teaching skills through observation and repetition rather than formal instruction. Yet oddly enough, skeletal analyses from some sites suggest variations in activity levels that may indicate differences in childhood workload across social groups. Scholars still bicker over whether these differences reflect class structure or seasonal labor demands. You glance again at the small figures in the dust. One child traces patterns with a stick, drawing lines that disappear as quickly as they form. Another builds a small mound, then knocks it down without hesitation, repeating the cycle with quiet focus. There is something deeply human in the repetition, something that echoes far beyond this moment. As you move past the cluster, the alley begins to widen again, leading you toward a more open district. The sounds of the city grow slightly louder, but not overwhelming. Instead, they feel layered like overlapping currents beneath a calm surface. And you carry the image of those children with you, a reminder that even in a forgotten city, life is always in motion, always learning itself anew. The alley finally releases you into a broader open space, and for a moment, the city feels as if it has exhaled. The density of walls relaxes here, replaced by a deliberate emptiness that draws your attention upward and forward. In the center of this district rises a structure that immediately changes the atmosphere around it, not through size alone, but through presence. It is the temple at the heart of the city. You approach slowly, almost instinctively, lowering your pace without being told to. The ground beneath you is more carefully maintained here, smoother, more compact, as if repeated passage has pressed intention into the earth itself. The structure ahead is built from larger, more uniform mud bricks, its walls rising higher and more deliberately than anything you have seen so far. Records confirm that in many ancient urban centers, central temples served not only religious functions, but also administrative and economic roles, often acting as hubs for storage redistribution and ceremonial activity. Yet oddly enough, some excavation sites reveal layers of purely domestic artifacts within temple precincts, leading scholars still to argue whether sacred and everyday life were truly separated or fundamentally intertwined. You step closer, and the air seems to change again. There is a stillness here, but it is not emptiness. It is anticipation. The faint scent of incense or burnt offerings lingers in your imagination, mixed with the earthy smell of clay warmed by the rising sun. A wide entrance opens before you, framed by thick walls. There are no towering stone columns in the later classical sense, but there is a clear attempt at monumental presence. You can feel how carefully this space was meant to be experienced. A curious footnote from archaeological findings suggests that temple layouts often aligned with astronomical or seasonal markers, though no agreement has been reached on whether these alignments were intentional cosmology or coincidental adaptation to environmental conditions. You step inside. The interior is cooler shaded from the brightness outside. Light filters in unevenly, creating soft gradients across plastered walls. Your footsteps, imagined or real, feel absorbed by the space. It does not echo loudly. It listens. At the center lies an open courtyard or hall, where offerings would likely have been placed. Records confirm that early temples frequently stored grain textiles and valuable goods, functioning as both spiritual and economic centers. Yet, oddly enough, some sites show sudden shifts in storage patterns over time, suggesting changes in authority or ritual practice that scholars still debate intensely. You notice small altars or platforms, simple but deliberate. Traces of ash suggest repeated use. The space feels layered, not just physically, but temporally, as if countless mornings like this one have accumulated invisibly. A figure appears at the edge of your awareness, perhaps a priest or caretaker. Their movements are calm, routine, unhurried. There is no dramatic gesture, only maintenance of continuity. Ritual here feels less like performance and more like structure. A faint detail catches your attention near one wall, small impressions in clay, possibly seals or symbolic marks. A curious footnote from excavation studies suggests that such marks may have functioned as administrative identifiers as much as spiritual symbols, blurring the line between governance and belief. You stand quietly in the center of the space. Outside, the city continues its slow unfolding. Inside, time feels slightly different, more measured, more deliberate. And you begin to sense that this temple is not separate from the city at all, but deeply embedded within its daily functioning, like a heartbeat hidden beneath layers of stone and dust. You remain within the temple for a few moments longer, and the quiet here begins to feel almost structured, as if silence itself has architecture. The cool interior holds you gently, while the faint light filtering through upper openings shifts slowly with the rising sun. Dust particles drift in those beams like suspended time, each one catching and releasing light in a soft, endless cycle. A subtle shift in atmosphere draws your attention upward. The temple is not only a place of offerings, but also of observation. High above, small openings or narrow slits allow the sky to be measured in fragments. Records confirm that many early religious centers incorporated lunar or solar tracking into their design, using shadow and light as tools for timekeeping. Yet oddly enough, some excavations show inconsistent alignments within the same structure, leading scholars still to argue whether these were precise systems or symbolic gestures misunderstood by modern interpretation. You imagine priests or attendants observing these changes daily, noting patterns that governed ritual life. Time here is not abstract. It is visible, almost tactile, shaped by light moving across stone. A faint sound interrupts the stillness. Footsteps, measured and slow, approach from deeper within the complex. A figure passes through your awareness again, carrying what might be a small vessel or offering container. Their presence is unhurried routine. Nothing here feels rushed. Everything feels repeated, refined through familiarity. A curious footnote from archaeological findings suggests that certain temple records were maintained not only in writing but also through symbolic counting systems using clay tokens or marks on tablets. However, no agreement has been reached on whether these systems were primarily administrative tools or held ritual significance tied to cosmic order. You move slightly toward a side chamber. The temperature shifts again, cooler still. Here the walls are less decorated, more functional. Shelving or recessed spaces line portions of the interior, some empty, others faintly stained by long use. Records confirm that temples often served as storage centers for surplus goods, especially grain and textiles, effectively linking spiritual authority with economic stability. Yet oddly enough, some excavation layers reveal abrupt changes in stored materials over time, as if priorities shifted suddenly. Scholars still bicker over whether these shifts represent political transitions, environmental pressures, or evolving religious practices. You pause near one of the walls, noticing faint impressions pressed into the clay surface. These markings are not random. They carry intent, though their meaning remains partially obscured. Some suggest ownership, others ritual cycles, others administrative control. Interpretation remains divided. The deeper you go, the more the temple reveals itself, not as a single-purpose space, but as a layered institution. Worship, governance, storage, timekeeping, all intertwined in ways that resist simple categorization. You return slowly toward the central hall. The light has shifted slightly now, indicating the morning is progressing outside. Life in the city continues to build momentum beyond these walls. As you exit, the brightness outside feels sharper for a moment, as if the world has become more immediate again. And you realize that what you have just witnessed is not only spiritual practice, but also the quiet framework that holds the entire city together. Stepping out of the temple, you feel the city's energy return in layers, as if someone has gradually raised the volume of the world around you. The brightness of the open air is almost surprising after the dim, measured quiet inside. Shadows shorten slightly now, and the morning has clearly matured into full activity. You move away from the temple precinct, following a gentle slope that leads toward one of the most essential districts of the entire settlement. The sounds begin to change again, not louder exactly, but heavier, more deliberate. The faint scrape of large containers being moved, the distant thud of sacks being set down, a rhythm of preparation that feels too structured to be casual. Ahead, you begin to see the outline of large storage buildings, long, low structures with thick walls and narrow entrances designed more for protection than display. Their presence is understated but unmistakably important. Records confirm that many ancient urban centers relied heavily on centralized grain storage systems to stabilize food supply across seasons. These systems often functioned as buffers against drought or poor harvests, ensuring survival during uncertain cycles. Yet oddly enough, some excavation sites reveal multiple overlapping storage layers built at different times, suggesting either expansion, redistribution, or administrative restructuring that scholars still debate. You approach one of the structures, noticing how cool the exterior feels even in the strengthening daylight. The thick mud brick walls are not just structural. They are functional insulation designed to preserve what lies inside. A narrow doorway opens into darkness. Inside, the air changes immediately. It is cooler, heavier, carrying the faint scent of dried grain and stored earth. Your eyes adjust slowly, and shapes begin to form. Rows of large ceramic jars, some tall enough to reach your shoulder, others wider and squat, all arranged with careful spacing. A curious footnote from archaeological excavations suggests that some storage jars were sealed with clay impressions bearing marks that may have indicated quantity, origin, or intended distribution. However, no agreement has been reached on whether these markings represent standardized accounting or more localized household-level tracking systems. You walk carefully between the rows. The silence here is different from the temple. It is functional silence shaped by necessity rather than reverence. Every object feels purposeful, every placement intentional. You imagine workers moving through this space daily, measuring, transferring, recording. Records confirm that grain management in early cities often required coordinated labor, sometimes overseen by administrative authorities, sometimes by temple institutions, depending on region. Yet, oddly enough, some evidence suggests that households also maintained private reserves, indicating a dual system of public and private storage that scholars still argue over. Your attention is drawn to markings on the floor, faint grooves where heavy containers were dragged into place. These patterns form invisible maps of repeated labor. Nothing here is random. Even wear becomes structure over time. A distant sound echoes through the storage hall, perhaps from an adjacent chamber. A soft clatter, then silence again. You are reminded that this space is not abandoned, but active part of the living mechanism of the city. You step back toward the entrance, and as you emerge into daylight again, the contrast is striking. Above ground, life feels fluid. Below it is carefully contained. And you begin to understand that this forgotten city does not simply survive through its buildings or rituals, but through the quiet discipline of what it chooses to preserve. You leave the storage district behind, and the city begins to loosen. A gimbo again, its structure shifting from heavy containment to creative motion. The air feels lighter here, less burdened by silence and preservation. Instead, it carries a faint rhythm, like something being shaped, struck, refined. Ahead, you hear it first before you see it. A steady, irregular cadence. Tap, pause, scrape, tap again. The sound is not chaotic, but layered like many small actions happening in coordination without needing constant instruction. You follow the noise into a workshop district where the city's artisans gather. The space is more open than the storage halls, but still enclosed enough to feel focused. Tables made of rough wood and stone line the area, each one occupied by tools, materials, and partially finished objects. Records confirm that craft production in early urban societies often included pottery weaving, metalworking, and stone tool refinement, frequently organized in household-based workshops rather than large industrial centers. Yet, oddly enough, some excavation sites reveal evidence of standardized tool marks across distant regions, suggesting shared techniques that scholars still argue may have spread through trade migration or informal apprenticeship networks. You step closer to one workstation where clay is being shaped, Hands press and rotate the material with practiced rhythm. The transformation is gradual, almost meditative. A lump becomes a vessel becomes a container for future use. Nothing here is rushed, but nothing is idle either. A curious footnote from archaeological findings suggests that some pottery fragments were intentionally discarded in specific layers, possibly indicating ritualized production cycles or symbolic ending of use. However, no agreement has been reached on whether these patterns reflect spiritual beliefs or simply practical waste management. You move further along the workshop row. Another station shows stone being chipped into tools. Small fragments scatter across the ground, evidence of precision hidden inside apparent destruction. The artisan's movements are controlled, repetitive, learned through repetition rather than instruction manuals or written guides. Nearby, a different craft emerges. Textile work. Fibers stretched, twisted, and woven into patterns that will eventually become cloth. Records confirm that textile production was often one of the most time-consuming domestic industries in ancient cities, frequently associated with household labor and seasonal rhythms. Yet, oddly enough, some preserved impressions suggest surprisingly complex designs, indicating aesthetic choices beyond pure functionality. You pause, noticing how each craft carries its own tempo. Pottery flows. Stone demands patience. Weaving requires continuous attention. Together they form a kind of silent orchestra of labor. A faint conversation drifts between workers, but it is not loud enough to dominate the space. Words are secondary here. Motion is primary. A curious detail catches your attention. A cluster of tools arranged carefully, even when not in use. Not scattered, not abandoned, but placed with intention. Archaeologists still bicker over whether such organization reflects early guild-like structures or simply personal discipline within independent households. You continue walking, feeling the workshop district stretch around you like a living organism. Every object here will eventually leave this space and enter homes, markets, temples. Nothing remains isolated, and as you move through it, you begin to sense something important. This city does not just consume life, it actively transforms it, reshaping raw material into the structure of daily existence. You move beyond the steady rhythm of the workshops, and the soundscape shifts once again, as if the city is rearranging its attention. The tapping, scraping, and weaving fade behind you, replaced by quieter footsteps and a more measured kind of stillness. Here, the architecture changes subtly, too. Spaces feel slightly more enclosed, more deliberate, as though conversation itself requires boundaries. Ahead, you enter a district that does not immediately reveal its purpose. There are no obvious workshops or storage halls here, no clear signs of trade or ritual. Instead, you notice modest buildings arranged around a slightly raised central area, almost like an informal gathering space. The air feels heavier, not with smoke or scent, but with intention. Records confirm that many early urban societies developed councils or assemblies of elders and administrators who met regularly to manage disputes, allocate resources, and coordinate communal responsibilities. Yet, oddly enough, excavation evidence for such spaces is often ambiguous, with no clear architectural markers separating political activity from domestic or religious use. Scholars still argue whether governance in these cities was centralized, distributed among families, or shared fluidly between institutions like temples and households. You step closer to the central area. There are no grand thrones or visible symbols of authority, only low seating arrangements, worn stone edges, and open space that suggests repeated gathering. It feels less like a place of command and more like a place of negotiation. A curious footnote from archaeological studies suggests that some administrative tablets were discovered in domestic contexts rather than official buildings, leading to debate over whether governance was embedded in everyday life rather than confined to formal institutions. However, no agreement has been reached on whether this reflects bureaucratic diffusion or simply the overlap of personal and civic responsibilities. You imagine the room filled with voices not raised but layered, people discussing grain distribution, labor obligations, trade agreements, and seasonal planning. Decisions here would not feel distant or abstract. They would feel immediate, tied directly to survival and daily rhythm. A faint impression remains in the ground, where people likely gathered repeatedly. The soil is slightly compacted in circular patterns, suggesting habitual seating arrangements. Nothing fixed, everything adaptable. You notice how different this space feels compared to the temple or storage district. There is no sense of sacred silence or heavy containment. Instead, there is negotiation embedded into the environment itself. Even the walls feel less imposing, as if they are meant to contain discussion rather than command it. Records confirm that early civic decision-making often overlapped with religious authority, especially in smaller cities where leadership roles were not clearly separated. Yet, oddly enough, some evidence shows that individuals may have held multiple roles simultaneously, acting as both ritual specialists and administrative coordinators. Scholars still bicker over whether this reflects a lack of specialization or a deliberately integrated social system. You walk slowly across the open space. There is no meeting happening now, but the residue of countless meetings remains. The air feels shaped by past arguments, agreements, and unresolved tensions. A nearby structure catches your attention. It is slightly elevated, perhaps used for announcements or public declarations. There are no inscriptions visible, but its placement suggests importance. You imagine someone standing there addressing gathered residents, their voice carrying across the space in carefully measured tones. And yet, what strikes you most is not authority, but balance. Nothing here feels absolute. Everything feels negotiated, adjusted, maintained through continuous interaction. As you leave the district, the city feels a little more complex than before, not divided into rulers and ruled, but layered with overlapping responsibilities that shift depending on time, place, and necessity. And you begin to sense that in this forgotten city, governance is not a distant structure above life, but something woven directly into its daily movement. You leave the quiet civic district behind, and the city gently changes its texture once again. The spaces begin to narrow, but not in the enclosing sense of residential alleys. Instead, they feel purposeful, almost concentrated, as if knowledge itself has gathered here and condensed into physical form. Ahead, you notice a building that is less about size and more about focus. Its entrance is modest, but there is something about the stillness around it that makes you slow your pace instinctively. The soundscape shifts too. The distant hum of workshops and conversation fades, replaced by a quieter, almost delicate rhythm. Inside, the air feels different again. Drier, more controlled. Light enters in thin, angled lines, illuminating surfaces that are not immediately recognizable until you look closer. rows of clay tablets, flat, rectangular, carefully shaped. Some are fresh, still bearing the softness of wet impressions. Others are hardened with time, their markings fixed permanently into baked earth. Records confirm that writing systems in early urban civilizations often developed from administrative needs, particularly the recording of goods transactions and labor obligations. Yet oddly enough, some of the earliest deciphered tablets contain lists that appear repetitive or symbolic rather than purely practical, leading scholars still to argue whether early writing was primarily economic ritual or something more abstract altogether. You step closer to one of the tablets. The markings are precise but unfamiliar, pressed into the clay with tools that leave sharp impressions. You can almost feel the pressure of creation the moment thought became fixed matter. A curious footnote from archaeological discoveries suggests that some scribes may have undergone extensive training, possibly within specialized institutions or household lineages, though no agreement has been reached on how formalized this education system truly was. Some researchers argue for early schools, while others suggest apprenticeship within family networks. You move slowly between the rows of tablets. There is a strange sense of silence here, not empty, but dense. It feels as though sound has been converted into structure. Every symbol holds weight. In one corner you notice a surface where tablets are being prepared. A scribe works carefully shaping clay, smoothing it, then pressing a stylus into it with deliberate control. The motion is repetitive but never careless. Each mark matters. Each impression is final. Records confirm that writing systems often began with accounting practices before expanding into more complex administrative and cultural uses. Yet oddly enough, some excavated tablets contain lists that do not correspond directly to known goods or systems, leading scholars still to debate whether early writing also served mnemonic or ceremonial functions beyond record-keeping. You glance at another tablet. It contains repeating patterns almost rhythmic in structure. Not language as we understand it, but structured expression nonetheless. It feels like the city is trying to remember itself through symbols. A faint awareness grows as you stand here. This is not just communication. It is preservation, control, memory made physical. A small detail catches your attention near the entrance. Clay seals with distinct impressions likely used to authorize or verify content. A curious footnote from archaeological studies suggests that some seals were associated with specific individuals or offices, hinting at early forms of identity verification. However, no agreement has been reached on whether these represent bureaucratic authority or more symbolic representations of trust. You step back slightly, feeling the weight of the space shift as you move. Outside, the city continues its ordinary motion, but inside here, everything is distilled into record, into structure, into permanence. And you begin to understand that this forgotten city does not only live through movement and labor, but also through memory, carefully shaped and preserved in clay. You leave the quiet building of clay tablets behind, and the city seems to breathe differently again, as if releasing tension you did not fully realize you were feeling. The air outside is warmer now, the sun higher, and with it comes a fuller, more complex soundscape. The day has reached its mid-rhythm when every part of the city is active at once. You follow a winding passage that gradually widens, and soon you find yourself moving through one of the main arteries of the settlement. This is not a grand avenue in the modern sense, but it functions as the city's central flow connecting districts like veins in a living body. Records confirm that many ancient urban layouts evolved organically around key routes linking markets, temples, and administrative centers. Yet oddly enough, excavations often reveal irregular angles and sudden shifts in direction, suggesting that these main roads were not always planned from the beginning, but emerged gradually from repeated use. Scholars still argue whether such layouts reflect intentional planning or cumulative habit shaped over generations. You walk slowly along the pathway, noticing how the surface underfoot changes subtly. Some sections are compacted hard by constant traffic, while others remain softer, almost uneven, revealing differences in intensity of use. The city here is not uniform. It is patterned by repetition. Movement increases around you. A cart passes at a measured pace, wheels creaking softly. A group of people walks in the opposite direction, carrying bundles wrapped in cloth. Conversations overlap briefly, then fade as paths diverge again. Nothing collides. Everything adjusts. A curious footnote from archaeological findings suggests that some cities employed informal spatial organization where certain groups or trades tended to cluster naturally in specific areas over time, rather than being formally assigned zones. However, no agreement has been reached on whether this reflects early zoning practices or simply the natural outcome of convenience and social preference. You notice how sound behaves differently here. It stretches farther but also disperses more quickly, as if the open corridor absorbs and redistributes it. Words become part of movement rather than stopping it. Along the sides of the passage, small structures appear intermittently. Storage niches, work alcoves, temporary stalls that may become permanent later in the day. The city feels flexible, constantly rearranging itself without losing coherence. Records confirm that many early cities relied heavily on foot traffic and human or animal transport, with infrastructure evolving slowly in response to demand. Yet, oddly enough, some excavation layers show repeated resurfacing of certain pathways, indicating long-term maintenance efforts that suggest coordinated communal responsibility. Scholars still bicker over whether this maintenance was organized centrally or performed by local households in shared obligation systems. You pause briefly at a junction where multiple paths intersect. It is not a formal square, but it functions like one. People gather here momentarily before dispersing again like currents splitting and merging in water. A faint impression remains in the ground, where movement is densest. The earth is slightly polished, smoothed by countless steps. You realize that the city is not only built from structures, but from repetition itself, from paths worn into existence by collective habit. As you continue forward, the central artery carries you deeper into the city's daily rhythm. The sense of fragmentation you felt in earlier districts begins to resolve into something more integrated, not organized in a rigid way, but flowing, adaptive, alive. And you begin to see that what holds this forgotten city together is not just walls or institutions, but the simple act of people moving through shared space again and again until movement itself becomes architecture. The central artery gradually narrows again, and the steady flow of movement around you begins to thin. The mid-morning energy of the city softens into something more controlled, more watchful. The sounds shift subtly, too. Fewer conversations, more isolated footsteps, a faint metallic echo that seems out of place among the earth and clay. You follow that change in sound without fully realizing it, and soon the architecture around you becomes more vertical, more imposing. Walls rise higher. Openings become fewer. The city feels as though it is quietly transitioning from openness to oversight. Ahead, you notice a structured boundary space. Not quite a gate, not quite a building, but something in between. There are raised platforms, simple watch points, and narrow passages that allow visibility across multiple directions. It is here that the city seems to observe itself. Records confirm that many early urban settlements maintained forms of patrol or guard systems, often positioned at strategic points, such as gate storage districts and major intersections. Yet oddly enough, archaeological evidence rarely shows standardized military infrastructure in these early cities, leading scholars still to argue whether security was formalized or more community-based and informal in nature. You move closer and the atmosphere tightens slightly, not in fear but in structure. There is an awareness here of boundaries of flow being monitored rather than simply allowed. A figure stands briefly at one of the raised points. Their posture is relaxed, not tense. They are not actively engaged in confrontation or control, but in observation. You notice how their attention moves across the pathways below, scanning rather than focusing. A curious footnote from excavation findings suggests that some watch points may have doubled as communication hubs, where signals or messages were relayed across districts using visual or auditory cues. However, no agreement has been reached on whether these systems were formalized networks or simply opportunistic use of elevation and visibility. You continue walking beneath these structures, noticing how the city subtly reorganizes itself around them. Movement is still fluid, but it feels slightly more aware, as if people instinctively adjust behavior within sight of oversight points. The ground here shows layered impressions of passage. Footsteps overlap in dense patterns, suggesting long-term, repeated use. Records confirm that cities often developed layered control systems, not only through formal authority but through spatial design that naturally guided behavior. Yet, oddly enough, some excavation sites show minimal evidence of coercive structures, leading scholars still to debate whether order was maintained through governance or cultural expectation. You pass beneath a narrow overhead structure, perhaps a connecting walkway or storage bridge. The shadow it casts is brief but distinct, marking a transition between zones. Sound becomes more fragmented here. Individual noises stand out more clearly, a door closing, a tool being set down, a brief exchange of words that does not carry far. It feels as though the city is compartmentalizing its own awareness. A faint detail catches your attention on one of the platforms. Small carved marks, possibly identifiers, or symbols of duty. A curious footnote from archaeological interpretation suggests that such markings may indicate rotating responsibilities among citizens or workers, though no agreement has been reached on whether these represent formal duty assignments or informal recognition systems. You pause briefly at the edge of this controlled zone. Beyond it, the city continues in its familiar rhythm. Behind it, the pathways feel slightly more structured, slightly more observed. And you begin to understand that this forgotten city does not rely only on walls for order, but also on visibility, awareness, and the quiet presence of watching eyes woven into its everyday movement. You leave the quiet, watchful district behind, and almost immediately the atmosphere of the city loosens again. The sense of observation fades, replaced by a gentler, more organic rhythm. The pathways widen slightly, and the soundscape grows warmer, fuller layered once more with human activity rather than oversight. The midday sun now sits higher, casting sharper light across the mud brick surfaces. Heat gathers in the walls, and you can feel the city adjusting to it, slowing just enough to remain comfortable. Movement continues, but it is no longer urgent or structured. It is habitual, almost ceremonial in its repetition. Ahead, you begin to notice subtle changes in decoration and space. Certain doorways are marked with simple patterns in clay. Some walls bear faint impressions that look less functional and more symbolic. You are entering a district shaped not only by labor or administration, but by seasonal rhythm. Records confirm that many early urban societies held periodic festivals tied to agricultural cycles, marking planting harvest, or transitions in seasonal weather patterns. Yet oddly enough, archaeological evidence often shows that these celebrations were not confined to a single location, but spread across multiple districts simultaneously, leading scholars still to argue whether they were centrally coordinated or locally adapted traditions sharing common themes. You pass a small open area where people gather in loose groups. There is food preparation here, but it feels less like routine cooking and more like shared activity. Large containers are being opened. Flat surfaces are arranged for distribution. The mood is different, slightly lighter, as if the city itself has entered a reflective pause within its own schedule. A curious footnote from excavation findings suggests that some ancient settlements show sudden increases in communal feasting debris during specific seasonal layers, indicating organized gatherings that may have held both social and symbolic significance. However, no agreement has been reached on whether these events were religious rituals, civic celebrations, or simply practical food distribution periods expanded into communal experience. You notice small decorative elements woven into everyday objects here. Simple patterns on pottery, slight variations in woven cloth. Nothing extravagant, but intentional enough to suggest meaning beyond utility. The city seems to express itself differently in this district, as if function briefly allows space for expression. A faint sound of rhythmic clapping or coordinated movement drifts from one corner of the space. It is not a performance in the modern sense, but a shared action. People moving together in brief synchrony, perhaps marking a transition in the day, or a communal moment of acknowledgement. Records confirm that many early urban societies incorporated collective labor and celebration, often blending work and ritual in ways that are difficult to separate from a modern perspective. Yet oddly enough, some excavation layers show evidence of repeated gatherings without clear ritual artifacts, leading scholars still to debate whether these were structured ceremonies or informal community traditions that became ritualized over time. You walk slowly through the space, noticing how sound behaves differently here again. It does not echo sharply or fragment. Instead, it blends as if the environment itself encourages cohesion. A group briefly passes you carrying shared items, their movement coordinated but unspoken. There is a sense of familiarity among them, not just of individuals, but of shared timing. You pause near the edge of the district, watching as the activity continues. Nothing dramatic happens. No single focal point defines the moment. Instead, it is the accumulation of small, coordinated actions that creates meaning. And you begin to understand that in this forgotten city, celebration is not separate from daily life, but woven into it, appearing in cycles like breath expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the world around it. You move away from the seasonal gathering space, and the city slowly transitions once more, as if turning a page in a long, uninterrupted story. The atmosphere becomes slightly more practical again, less celebratory, more outward-facing. Paths widen and straighten, suggesting direction rather than pause. Ahead, you begin to notice activity that feels oriented toward movement beyond the city itself. People carry bundled goods wrapped tightly in cloth. Containers are secured with rope. There is a sense of preparation of things meant to leave rather than remain. Records confirm that many early urban centers were deeply connected to regional trade networks, exchanging grain, textiles, metals, and crafted goods across considerable distances for their time. Yet oddly enough, archaeological evidence often reveals uneven distribution of imported materials, suggesting that trade routes may have been irregular, seasonal, or controlled by shifting groups, rather than stable, long-distance systems. Scholars still argue over whether these networks were formally organized or operated through loose chains of intermediaries. You follow the direction of movement, and the city gradually opens toward one of its outer corridors. The air feels slightly different here, less enclosed, more exposed to wind. Dust rises more easily from the ground, carried in thin spirals that catch the sunlight. A group of merchants passes nearby. Their conversation is low fragmented, filled with references you cannot fully place, distant regions, unfamiliar materials, prices measured in systems that feel both structured and fluid at the same time. There is no single language of trade that dominates completely, but rather overlapping patterns of exchange. A curious footnote from archaeological findings suggests that some ancient trade goods appear far from their production origins, sometimes with no clear intermediate stops, leading scholars still to debate whether these were direct long-distance exchanges or the result of multiple smaller transactions accumulating over time. You notice small resting points along the path, simple shaded areas where travelers might pause before continuing outward. The city is no longer just a contained system, it is a node in a wider network. Records confirm that early urban economies often depended on regional interdependence, especially for materials not locally available, such as certain metals or stones. Yet, oddly enough, some sites show evidence of locally produced imitations of imported goods, suggesting not only trade, but also cultural adaptation and replication. Scholars still bicker over whether this reflects economic necessity, prestige imitation, or early forms of symbolic consumption. You pause near a junction where the path splits outward. One direction leads further into agricultural land, the other toward distant settlements beyond the city's immediate influence. The sense of expansion is palpable here, even if you cannot see the destination. A faint sound of animals or carts moving past reaches you intermittently, though never fully visible. The city feels like it is constantly sending and receiving breathing through these routes. You notice how information seems to travel alongside goods. Words exchanged at these points carry knowledge of weather harvests, distant events. Nothing formal is written here, yet everything is communicated. A curious detail emerges in your awareness. Small markers placed along the path, possibly indicating distances or rest points. A footnote from excavation studies suggests that such markers may have served both practical navigation and symbolic territorial definition, though no agreement has been reached on their precise function. As you stand at this threshold of movement, you begin to see the city not as an isolated place, but as something constantly reaching outward, connected by invisible threads of exchange and dependency. And you realize that its survival is not only built within its walls, but extended far beyond them into landscapes and relationships that stretch further than you can currently see. You turn away from the outward-facing trade paths, and the city begins to feel enclosed again, as if pulling its attention back inward. The sound of distant movement fades gradually, replaced once more by layered urban noise, footsteps, conversation fragments, the occasional metallic clink from nearby workspaces. The architecture shifts subtly as you re-enter denser districts. Walls feel closer again, but not restrictive. Instead, they feel purposeful, guiding you toward another concentration of activity. You notice storage niches built into walls, small alcoves that suggest goods are being temporarily held, sorted, or inspected. Ahead, you enter a space that feels distinctly different in character. It is not purely residential nor entirely commercial. Instead, it has the quality of a distribution zone where goods from outside the city are processed, evaluated, and integrated into daily life. Records confirm that early urban centers often received a wide range of imported materials, including metals, stones, decorative objects, and luxury items that were not locally available. Yet, oddly enough, excavation evidence frequently shows that such goods were unevenly distributed across households, leading scholars still to debate whether access was controlled by social hierarchy, administrative allocation, or simple market dynamics. You approach a cluster of objects laid out on a low platform, small beads of stone and shell, pieces of metal shaped into unfamiliar forms, fragments of materials that feel out of place in the local environment. Each item carries the sense of distance, as if it has traveled far before arriving here. A curious footnote from archaeological findings suggests that some imported goods show signs of reworking or modification after arrival, indicating that foreign materials were not only consumed, but actively transformed to fit local aesthetics or functional needs. However, no agreement has been reached on whether this reflects cultural adaptation or economic pragmatism. You move slowly through the space, noticing how handlers or workers examine items with practiced attention. There is no sense of haste, but there is discernment. Each object is assessed, categorized, integrated into the city's existing systems. A faint sound of negotiation drifts nearby. Not loud, but persistent. It suggests exchange, though not necessarily formalized pricing structures. Records confirm that value systems in early urban economies could vary significantly depending on context, with goods sometimes measured in weight, sometimes in labor equivalents, and sometimes in more abstract social terms. Yet oddly enough, some evidence suggests that symbolic prestige played a significant role in determining value, complicating purely economic interpretations. Scholars still argue over how standardized these systems truly were. You notice how certain objects are placed together almost as if grouped by origin or type. There is an emerging logic here, though not fully formalized in a way recognizable to modern classification systems. A worker passes nearby, carrying a container filled with mixed materials. The movement is steady, habitual. Nothing about it suggests novelty, only repetition. And yet each item represents a journey, a connection between distant places and this concentrated urban core. A curious detail catches your attention near one corner of the district markings, etched into storage surfaces, possibly indicating quantities or ownership. A footnote from excavation studies suggests that such markings may represent early accounting systems or inventory tracking, though no agreement has been reached on whether they were standardized or locally invented conventions. You pause briefly, observing how this space operates as a point of convergence. Goods arrive, are assessed, and then distributed outward into other districts. The city processes the world through this layer of exchange. As you step back from the platform, the impression remains clear. This forgotten city is not isolated at all. It is constantly absorbing external influence, reshaping it, and redistributing it in forms that sustain its internal balance. And you begin to sense that what enters the city from beyond its walls is just as important as what is produced within them. You leave the exchange district behind, and the city softens once again into a quieter rhythm. The density of imported goods fades from view, replaced by more familiar materials, clay wood woven fibers and stone shaped by local hands. The air feels warmer here, not in temperature, but in tone, as if the city is turning inward again, toward knowledge that is intimate rather than distant. You follow a narrower path that winds gently between modest structures. Soon, the soundscape changes. It becomes softer, more irregular. Occasional murmurs, the faint rustle of dried plants, a slow, deliberate movement that suggests careful attention rather than production or trade. Ahead, you notice a small gathering space shaded by a light canopy. People move here with quiet purpose, tending to bundles of plants laid across flat surfaces. Leaves, roots, dried stems, and small containers of liquid substances are arranged in careful order. The air carries a complex scent, earthy and slightly bitter mixed with something faintly floral. Records confirm that early urban societies often relied on herbal and botanical knowledge for healing practices, drawing from local ecosystems to treat illness, discomfort, and injury. Yet oddly enough, archaeological evidence sometimes reveals mixtures of plants that would not traditionally grow together in the same environment, suggesting either extensive trade in medicinal materials or a highly experimental approach to treatment. Scholars still argue over whether these practices were based on empirical observation, ritual tradition, or a blend of both. You step closer to one of the work surfaces. A figure carefully crushes dried leaves using a stone tool, reducing them into fine fragments. Another measures liquid into a small clay vessel. Movements are precise, repetitive, almost ceremonial in their consistency. A curious footnote from excavation findings suggests that some ancient healing spaces show overlaps with ritual artifacts, including symbolic objects placed near medicinal tools. However, no agreement has been reached on whether this indicates that healing and spirituality were inseparable or simply co-located within shared domestic environments. You notice how knowledge here is not written, at least not visibly. It is carried through repetition, observation, and memory. Each gesture seems inherited rather than instructed, passed from one generation to the next through practice. A faint detail catches your attention near the edge of the space. Small markings on containers, possibly indicating dosage, preparation type, or intended use. Records confirm that early medical systems often lacked standardized classification, instead relying on experiential categorization. Yet, oddly enough, some findings suggest surprisingly consistent treatment patterns across distant regions, leading scholars still to debate whether this reflects shared cultural knowledge or independent convergence of similar practices. You watch as a preparation is completed. The mixture is transferred carefully into a sealed vessel. There is no sense of urgency, only attention. Whatever purpose this serves, it is treated with quiet seriousness. Nearby, another individual examines plant material against natural light as if assessing quality or condition. The process feels observational rather than theoretical, grounded in direct interaction with material reality. You become aware that this space operates on a different kind of understanding than the administrative or commercial districts. Here, knowledge is not quantified or traded. It is applied, refined, tested through use. A soft sound breaks the stillness briefly, perhaps a container being set down or a tool being cleaned. Then silence returns, layered rather than empty. As you step back from the gathering space, you carry with you the impression of a system built on careful attention to the body, to nature, and to the subtle relationships between them. And you begin to understand that in this forgotten city, knowledge does not only exist in tablets or trade, but also in the living memory of plants and healing hands. You leave the herbal gathering space behind, and the city begins to feel heavier again, not in sound or movement, but in presence. The pathways slope gently downward, without obvious intention, as if guiding you toward something the city keeps beneath its surface, rather than within its daily rhythm. The air cools slightly as you descend. Light becomes more fragmented here, filtered through narrower openings between structures. The sounds of healing work and daily life fade, replaced by a quieter, more enclosed atmosphere. Even footsteps feel different, less echoing, more absorbed. Ahead you notice a subtle shift in the terrain. The ground is less compacted, more uneven. Small markers appear intermittently, simple arrangements of stone or disturbed earth that suggest repeated passage, but also deliberate placement. You sense that you are approaching a space the city treats differently. Records confirm that many ancient urban settlements contain designated burial zones located within or just outside residential areas, often reflecting complex relationships between the living and the dead. Yet oddly enough, excavation findings frequently reveal overlapping burial layers within the same zones, suggesting long-term reuse of space that scholars still argue may indicate either spatial necessity or evolving ritual practice. You step carefully into a more enclosed area. The temperature drops again. The light feels thinner, more subdued. Here, the city's noise does not reach easily. Instead, there is a stillness that feels structured, almost intentional. You notice shallow depressions in the ground, some marked by simple stone placements. Others appear more carefully arranged with small objects placed alongside. These are not grand monuments. They are modest, functional, and deeply human. A curious footnote from archaeological studies suggests that some burial sites contained personal items, pottery fragments, or symbolic objects placed with the deceased, though no agreement has been reached on whether these represent beliefs about the afterlife, expressions of identity, or practical closures of ownership and belonging. You move slowly through the space, aware that this district does not operate on the same temporal logic as the rest of the city. Everything here feels layered not in activity but in memory. Records confirm that burial practices in early urban societies varied widely even within the same cultural regions. Some individuals were interred in family groups, others in collective spaces. Yet oddly enough, skeletal analyses sometimes show unexpected variation in treatment, leading scholars still to debate whether social status, profession, or ritual belief determined burial form. You pause near one of the marked areas. There is nothing dramatic here, no grandeur, only continuity. The impression is of repeated care over long periods of time. A faint detail catches your attention near the edge of the burial zone, small markers that may indicate orientation or sequence. A curious footnote from excavation findings suggests that spatial arrangement in burial contexts may have followed symbolic or practical logics tied to family structure or seasonal cycles, though no agreement has been reached on their precise meaning. You stand quietly for a moment. Above you, the city continues its life uninterrupted. Work, trade, movement, healing, governance, all continuing in parallel layers. Yet here everything feels slowed, as if time itself has thickened. And you begin to understand that this forgotten city does not separate life and death as sharply as modern systems might assume. Instead, both exist within the same landscape, sharing space, memory, and earth. You leave the burial district behind, and as you ascend back toward the living layers of the city, the atmosphere subtly shifts again. It is almost imperceptible at first, a gradual return of sound, of movement, of everyday life reclaiming the air. The silence you just experienced does not disappear, but it recedes, becoming one layer among many rather than the dominant tone. The path upward is worn smooth in places, suggesting frequent travel between these contrasting zones. You can feel the change in temperature as you rise, the air warming slightly with each step. Light returns more fully, and with it, the texture of the city becomes once again active, present, unfolding. Ahead, you hear a new kind of rhythm. Not the tapping of pottery, nor the murmuring of trade, nor the measured silence of governance. This is sharper, faster, more metallic, a repeating sequence that feels almost mechanical in its consistency. You follow the sound into a workshop district once again, but this one feels different from the earlier craft spaces. The focus here is on strength and transformation of harder materials. Stone and bronze dominate the environment. The air carries a faint metallic scent, dry and slightly bitter like heat meeting ore. Records confirm that bronze and stone tools were central to early urban economies used for agriculture, construction, and daily labor. Yet oddly enough, microscopic analysis of some recovered tools reveals unexpectedly precise wear patterns, suggesting a level of technical understanding that scholars still argue may have been more advanced than traditionally assumed for this period. You step closer to one workstation where a craftsman is shaping metal. The process is slow but relentless. Heat hammer, reshape, repeat. Each strike produces a sharp, clean sound that briefly dominates the space before fading into the larger rhythm of the workshop. A curious footnote from archaeological findings suggests that some early metallurgical sites show evidence of controlled heating environments that may have allowed more consistent alloy production, though no agreement has been reached on whether this represents intentional scientific control or gradual experiential refinement over generations. You move along the workshop edge. Nearby stone tools are being shaped through controlled impact. Fragments scatter across the ground in predictable patterns. Nothing here feels random. Even waste is structured. You notice how different materials seem to demand different kinds of attention. Metal requires heat and patience. Stone requires precision and repetition. Both require a deep familiarity with resistance, with how matter responds to force. Records confirm that specialized craft production in early cities often involved apprenticeship-like systems, where skills were transmitted through observation and repetition rather than formal instruction. Yet, oddly enough, some excavation evidence suggests standardized techniques across distant regions, leading scholars still to debate whether knowledge spread through migration trade networks or shared cultural traditions. You pause briefly, watching a tool take shape. It is not yet complete, but its function is already visible in its form. There is something deeply intentional about this process, as if utility is being slowly revealed rather than imposed. A faint sound of discussion passes between workers, short and practical, not theoretical, not abstract. Language here is tied directly to action. Each word seems to serve a purpose and then disappear. A curious detail catches your attention. Near a storage corner, grouped tools arranged by size and function, suggesting an emerging sense of classification. A footnote from excavation studies suggests that such organization may reflect early proto-standardization in craft production, though no agreement has been reached on whether this was formal systemization or individual workshop habit. You step back slightly, letting the rhythm of creation settle around you, and you begin to see that in this forgotten city, craftsmanship is not just production. It is a continuous negotiation between material skill and time, repeated until function becomes form. You leave the metallic rhythm of the craft district behind, and the city's soundscape softens once more, as if exhaling after sustained intensity. The air feels lighter again, though not quieter. Instead, it becomes more fluid, carrying intermittent bursts of movement and sound that drift rather than accumulate. The path you follow bends gently, leading you toward a district where water and structure begin to overlap again. You notice shallow channels carved into the ground, some lined with compacted clay, others reinforced with simple stone edges. The design is modest but deliberate, guiding flow rather than controlling it entirely. Records confirm that many early urban environments incorporated basic water management systems, not only for drinking and cooking, but also for cleansing and symbolic purification practices. Yet oddly enough, excavation evidence often shows multiple overlapping channel systems in the same districts, suggesting either repeated reconstruction or coexisting approaches to water use that scholars still debate. You approach one of the channels. Water moves slowly through it, reflecting fragments of sky and wall in broken patterns. The surface is not perfectly clear, but it is steady, reliable part of a cycle that repeats daily without ceremony, yet carries deep significance. A nearby structure draws your attention. It is small, partially enclosed, and seems designed for brief gatherings rather than long occupation. You notice basins, simple stone platforms, and areas where water has clearly been poured and allowed to run off deliberately. A curious footnote from archaeological findings suggests that some ancient urban spaces show repeated evidence of water use combined with ritual-like arrangements, though no agreement has been reached on whether these practices were primarily hygienic, symbolic, or a blend of both. You step closer and observe how people interact with this space. Movements are gentle, intentional. Hands are washed, containers are rinsed, water is shared, then allowed to return to the channels. There is no wasteful excess, only careful circulation. Records confirm that cleanliness practices in early cities varied widely, depending on region and available resources. Yet, oddly enough, some settlements show surprisingly structured patterns of water use in domestic and communal spaces, leading scholars still to argue whether these reflect early hygiene systems or socially embedded symbolic routines tied to purity and order. You notice how sound behaves differently here again. The splash of water is soft but constant, creating a subtle background rhythm. Voices are subdued, as if the presence of water naturally encourages restraint. A faint detail catches your attention. Near one basin, small grooves etched into stone that may have helped direct flow or control splashing. A footnote from excavation studies suggests that such features may represent early engineering awareness of fluid movement, though no agreement has been reached on whether they were intentional design innovations or accumulated refinements from repeated use. You move slowly through the space, noticing how water is not treated as static, but as something continuously moving, shared and returned. Even the architecture seems to acknowledge this flow, with edges shaped to guide rather than resist. Nearby, you see a group briefly pause to perform a sequence of actions around water use that feels consistent, repeated, not necessarily formalized ritual, but not purely functional either. It sits somewhere in between, like many systems in this city. Records confirm that water-related practices often held both practical and symbolic importance in early societies, shaping how communities understood cleanliness, transition, and renewal. Yet, oddly enough, no agreement has been reached on whether these meanings were consciously structured or emerged gradually through habit and repetition. You step back from the channel and feel the district settling around you again into its gentle rhythm. The city continues to function, but here it does so with a kind of softness, as if acknowledging the necessity of renewal at every level. And you begin to understand that in this forgotten city, water is not only a resource, it is a quiet framework that connects movement, care, and continuity across daily life. You leave the water channels behind, and the city subtly shifts again, as if transitioning from cleansing to order. The sounds around you become more structured, less fluid. Footsteps feel more directed. Conversations slightly more purposeful, as though people are moving within invisible boundaries you cannot fully see. The path narrows briefly before opening into a district that feels less defined by activity and more by regulation. The architecture here is plain but intentional. Walls are evenly spaced. Openings are consistent. There is a sense of standardization that contrasts with the organic variation you have seen in earlier districts. Records confirm that many early urban societies developed systems of rules governing trade, family responsibilities, and civic obligations, often preserved through oral tradition or early written records. Yet, oddly enough, archaeological evidence rarely shows complete legal codices in a single unified form, leading scholars still to debate whether these societies operated under formal law or flexible customary systems applied contextually. You walk slowly through the area, noticing how interactions seem slightly more deliberate here. Exchanges are brief but structured. Requests are answered with measured responses. Even silence feels regulated, as if people are aware of shared expectations. A nearby wall bears faint impressions, possibly symbolic markers, or administrative notations. A curious footnote from excavation findings suggests that some ancient settlements used simple inscribed signs to indicate obligations, property boundaries, or trade agreements. Though no agreement has been reached on whether these represent early legal systems or informal record-keeping practices, you pause near a small open space where two individuals appear to be negotiating. Their gestures are restrained, their attention focused. There is no visible authority overseeing them, yet the interaction feels guided by understood rules. Something unspoken is clearly at work here. Records confirm that early systems of governance often blended social expectation with practical necessity. creating frameworks that functioned without fully codified enforcement. Yet, oddly enough, some sites show evidence of repeated dispute resolution patterns in specific locations, suggesting designated spaces for conflict resolution or administrative arbitration, though scholars still bicker over how formalized these practices truly were. You continue walking, observing how property and space are subtly indicated, not through rigid barriers, but through shifts in material elevation or repeated use patterns. The city seems to communicate rules through design rather than explicit instruction. A faint detail catches your attention near a doorway, small marks carved into clay, possibly indicating ownership, responsibility, or trade association. A footnote from archaeological interpretation suggests that such markings may represent early identity systems tied to household or occupational groups, though no agreement has been reached on their precise function. You notice how behavior changes depending on location. People adjust their movement slightly, their tone of voice, their pace. It is not enforced loudly, but it is consistently observed. The city's order feels distributed rather than centralized. Records confirm that many ancient urban communities relied heavily on shared cultural norms to maintain stability, reducing the need for direct enforcement. Yet oddly enough, variations in artifact distribution suggest that compliance may have been uneven, leading scholars still to debate how strictly such systems were followed in practice. You pause at the edge of the district, looking back at the structured pathways behind you. Everything feels organized but not rigid, flexible but not chaotic. And you begin to understand that in this forgotten city, order is not imposed from a single source. It is maintained through shared understanding, repeated behavior, and the quiet alignment of daily life. You leave the structured district behind, and the city gradually loosens again, as if releasing tension it has been quietly holding. The pathways widen slightly, and the sounds become more varied, less regulated. A mix of conversation, movement, and distant labor returns layered like overlapping currents. The architecture shifts subtly here, too. Doorways are more open. Courtyards appear more frequently. The sense of strict alignment fades into something more domestic, more lived in. You feel yourself moving into a space where private life and public rhythm begin to overlap again. Ahead, you notice clusters of homes arranged around shared courtyards. The layout suggests cooperation, but also independence within proximity. Smoke rises gently from several hearths at once, drifting upward and dispersing into the warm air. Records confirm that in many early urban societies, household economies were central to production and daily survival, with family units often managing food preparation, textile work, and small-scale trade. Yet, oddly enough, archaeological evidence sometimes shows women's roles appearing prominently in certain economic artifacts, while textual interpretation remains incomplete or ambiguous, leading scholars still to debate the full extent of gendered labor organization in these societies. You step closer to one courtyard where daily activity is already underway. Hands are shaping dough, grinding grain, weaving fibers. The movements are familiar, practiced, deeply embedded in routine. Nothing here feels experimental. Everything feels repeated into reliability. A faint sound of conversation flows between individuals working in different corners of the space. It is not structured discussion, but continuous coordination. Tasks are divided without formal instruction, suggesting shared understanding built through long familiarity. A curious footnote from archaeological findings suggests that some domestic spaces show evidence of specialized tools concentrated in particular households, implying differences in production roles or economic status, though no agreement has been reached on whether this reflects social hierarchy or flexible household specialization. You observe how work here is both individual and collective. One person manages fire, another prepares materials, another organizes finished goods. Yet all activities are connected through shared space and timing. Records confirm that domestic economies in early cities were often deeply integrated into broader urban systems, contributing significantly to local production and distribution. Yet oddly enough, some sites reveal unexpected uniformity in household tools across different social contexts, leading scholars still to argue whether material equality reflected cultural norms or practical standardization. You notice a subtle shift in attention as you move through the courtyard. Your presence does not disrupt activity, but it is acknowledged briefly through glance and pause before work resumes. Life continues without interruption. A small detail catches your eye near one work area markings on storage containers that may indicate household identification or production batches. A footnote from excavation interpretation suggests that such markings could represent early forms of economic accounting at the household level, though no agreement has been reached on whether they were formal systems or informal tracking methods. You step back slightly, taking in the full rhythm of the space. It is not centralized or hierarchical in appearance. Instead, it feels distributed, balanced across multiple points of activity that sustain one another. And you begin to understand that in this forgotten city, households are not separate from the economy. They are its foundation, quietly sustaining the flow of goods, labor, and continuity through everyday action. You leave the courtyard behind, and the city gradually opens once more, as if shifting its attention outward again. The density of domestic rhythm softens into something more expansive. The pathways widen, and the movement of people begins to increase, carrying a sense of convergence rather than isolation. The sun is higher now, and its light settles more evenly across the city. Shadows are shorter, more compact, less dramatic. The atmosphere feels balanced between morning activity and the anticipation of afternoon exchange. Ahead, you begin to hear the familiar rise of market sound before you see it fully. A layered hum of voices, the soft impact of goods being set down, the subtle negotiation of space and attention. The city is gathering itself again into commerce. You enter a familiar open district, but it feels different from earlier, more established, more complete. This is not the quiet preparation phase you witnessed before. This is the fully active cycle of exchange in motion. Records confirm that ancient urban markets often followed seasonal rhythms tied closely to agricultural production cycles, with peak activity occurring after harvest periods or during predictable trade windows. Yet oddly enough, excavation layers sometimes reveal sudden bursts of market activity in unexpected periods, leading scholars still to debate whether this reflects irregular trade patterns or incomplete preservation of seasonal data. You move slowly through the space. The earlier emptiness is gone. Now it is filled with layered interaction. People stand in clusters, goods arranged on surfaces, containers opened and closed in steady rhythm. The air is thicker here, not physically but socially, as if every interaction adds density to the environment. A curious footnote from archaeological findings suggests that some market areas show repeated rearrangement of stall positions over time, indicating either flexible organization or evolving social hierarchies within trade spaces, though no agreement has been reached on whether these changes were formally regulated or organically adapted. You notice how value is expressed here not only through exchange, but through attention. Items are examined closely. Weight, texture, origin, and condition all seem to matter. Yet there is no universal system visible to you, only repeated patterns of assessment and agreement. Records confirm that early market systems often combined barter-weighted exchange and symbolic valuation depending on context and region. Yet oddly enough, some evidence suggests that certain goods consistently held elevated status regardless of practical utility, leading scholars still to argue whether prestige or necessity shaped value more strongly in these environments. You pause near a central cluster of activity where exchanges appear more frequent. Hands move quickly but carefully. Items are passed, considered accepted or declined without visible tension. There is a rhythm to refusal as much as acceptance. A faint detail catches your attention, nearby markings on containers and surfaces that may indicate pricing conventions or origin identifiers. A footnote from excavation interpretation suggests that such markings could represent early attempts at standardization in trade communication, though no agreement has been reached on whether these systems were widely understood or limited to specific groups. You observe how movement flows through the market space like water through channels. People enter, circulate, and exit without disruption. Even density does not create stagnation. Instead, it creates layered motion. A distant sound of laughter or brief exchange breaks through the otherwise practical atmosphere, reminding you that this is not only a system of economy, but also of human interaction. Relationships are embedded within transactions, even if briefly. As you step back from the busiest area, the market begins to feel less like a single space and more like a constantly shifting organism, reconfiguring itself with each exchange. And you begin to understand that in this forgotten city, the economy is not separate from life. It is life expressed through movement, negotiation, and continuous adaptation. You leave the busy market behind, and the city slowly begins to quiet again, but not in the restful sense. It is a different kind of quiet now, one that feels slightly uneven, as if something beneath the surface has changed its rhythm. The pathways are still active, but the flow of movement feels less certain, more scattered. You notice subtle shifts as you walk. Some areas appear less maintained than before, not neglected exactly, but not as carefully tended. The smooth continuity you observed earlier begins to break into small irregularities. A cracked section of wall here, a partially collapsed edge there. Nothing dramatic on its own, but together it forms a pattern you cannot ignore. Records confirm that many ancient urban settlements experienced periods of gradual decline rather than sudden collapse, often marked by environmental stress, resource shortages, or shifting trade networks. Yet, oddly enough, archaeological layers sometimes show signs of continued activity even during these transitional phases, leading scholars still to debate whether decline was uniform across all districts or unevenly distributed within the same city. You move through a quieter corridor where fewer people pass. Conversations are more sporadic. Some doorways remain open, others partially sealed or abandoned. The sense of continuity you felt earlier begins to fragment slightly, as if different parts of the city are responding to change at different speeds. A curious footnote from excavation findings suggests that certain districts show evidence of adaptive reuse of structures during later phases, with homes converted into workshops or storage spaces, though no agreement has been reached on whether this reflects resilience or gradual disorganization. You pause near a building where activity still continues, though reduced. A few individuals move inside, maintaining routines that appear unchanged. It is a reminder that cities do not decline uniformly. Life persists in pockets even as broader systems shift. Records confirm that urban resilience in ancient contexts often depended on localized adaptation, with households and small groups maintaining continuity even when larger administrative structures weakened. Yet, oddly enough, some evidence suggests that cultural practices remained stable longer than economic systems, leading scholars still to argue whether social cohesion or material resources played the primary role in sustaining these communities. You continue walking and notice how sound behaves differently here again. It is not absent, but it is fragmented. Isolated noises instead of continuous flow, a door closing, a tool being set down, a brief exchange of words that does not extend beyond its immediate moment. A faint detail catches your attention near a partially open space. Scattered objects that appear to have been left in place rather than actively used. A footnote from archaeological interpretation suggests that such patterns may indicate gradual abandonment or shifting population density, though no agreement has been reached on whether these represent planned relocation or organic migration over time. You step carefully through the area, sensing that the city is still functioning, but no longer in perfect synchrony. Different parts move at different speeds now. And you begin to understand that in this forgotten city, continuity is not guaranteed. It is something maintained unevenly, held together by some districts more than others, slowly shifting under pressures that are not immediately visible. You leave the uneven district behind, and the city feels quieter again, but this time the quiet carries weight. It is not the calm of early morning or the softness of ritual spaces. It is something more hesitant, as if the city is speaking more carefully now, choosing what to reveal and what to hold back. The pathways narrow slightly, and you begin to notice gaps in continuity that were not as visible before. A doorway without a corresponding neighbor, a courtyard partially filled with debris, a wall that has been left unrepaired for longer than expected. None of it is catastrophic on its own, but together it forms a language of absence. Records confirm that many ancient urban centers underwent phases of gradual population movement, often influenced by environmental shifts, resource availability, or changing trade routes. Yet, oddly enough, archaeological evidence sometimes shows that these changes did not occur uniformly across entire cities, leading scholars still to debate whether abandonment happened in waves clusters or gradual household-by-household transitions. You move through a residential area that feels partially inhabited. Some homes are active with faint smoke rising and movement inside. Others stand still, their courtyards silent, their entrances open but unused. The contrast is subtle but persistent, like a rhythm that has lost its regular beat. A curious footnote from excavation findings suggests that some abandoned structures were later reused for storage or secondary activities, indicating that departure from certain areas may not have been absolute, but adaptive. However, no agreement has been reached on whether these patterns represent planned resettlement or gradual dispersal driven by changing conditions. You pause in a small, open space where signs of daily life remain, but less densely than before. A broken vessel left near a wall, a partially dismantled tool, traces of activity that have not yet been fully erased by time. Records confirm that urban continuity often depended on the ability of households to remain stable even as broader systems shifted. Yet, oddly enough, some sites show that cultural practices persisted longer than physical occupation, suggesting that memory and tradition outlasted settlement density in certain regions. Scholars still argue over whether cultural continuity can exist independently of urban stability. You continue walking, noticing how silence accumulates differently here. It is not empty, but layered. Each quiet space feels like a pause between sentences rather than an ending. A faint movement draws your attention to a distant structure. Someone still present, still maintaining routine. A small reminder that life continues even in reduced form. The city is not gone. It is adjusting, redistributing itself. A curious detail catches your eye near a collapsed edge of wall. Faint impressions of repeated repairs layered over time. A footnote from archaeological interpretation suggests that such layering may indicate prolonged attempts to maintain habitation, though no agreement has been reached on whether this reflects resilience or delayed abandonment. You move carefully through the area, aware that you are now seeing the city in a different phase. Not its peak, not its origin, but something in between. A transitional state where presence and absence coexist. And you begin to understand that in this forgotten city, disappearance is not immediate. It is gradual, uneven, and deeply human in its progression. You leave the partially emptied district behind, and the city opens slightly once more, but it feels different now. Not empty, not abandoned, but loosened, as if its structure is no longer holding with the same tension as before. The pathways are still familiar, yet they carry fewer footsteps, fewer overlapping rhythms. The air is still warm, but it feels thinner somehow, as if less movement is stirring it. You notice how sound travels farther now, no longer absorbed by constant activity. Even distant noises feel more distinct, more isolated, as though the city is beginning to speak in individual voices rather than collective ones. You move toward what once seemed like one of the more active districts. The architecture remains intact, but the energy has shifted. Doorways stand open without frequent passage. Courtyards are quiet for longer stretches of time. The impression is not of collapse, but of delay, as if life is happening elsewhere, or more slowly, or not all at once. Records confirm that many ancient urban centers experienced late-stage administrative attempts to stabilize population and resource distribution during periods of transition. Yet, oddly enough, archaeological evidence sometimes shows continued maintenance of infrastructure even as population density decreased, leading scholars still to debate whether these efforts represent resilience obligation or symbolic continuity. You pass through a space that once felt active. Now it holds traces of its former rhythm rather than the rhythm itself. A storage niche remains partially filled. A work surface shows signs of use, but not recent activity. The city remembers itself in objects rather than motion. A curious footnote from excavation findings suggests that in some settlements, administrative records continued to be produced even during phases of reduced habitation, though no agreement has been reached on whether this reflects bureaucratic persistence or delayed archival closure of civic systems. You pause near a central passage. The path ahead is still clear, still functional, but less traveled. The earth shows fewer overlapping impressions. The patterns of movement are no longer dense, but sparse and separated. Records confirm that urban contraction in ancient contexts often occurred unevenly, with certain districts maintaining activity longer than others due to economic, environmental, or social factors. Yet oddly enough, some sites show surprising continuity in ritual or symbolic spaces, even after residential decline, leading scholars still to argue whether cultural institutions outlasted everyday urban life or simply adapted to reduced populations. You continue forward, noticing how the city feels both familiar and unfamiliar at once. The structure remains, but its use has shifted. It is like walking through memory that is still in the process of fading. A faint sound echoes in the distance, perhaps a final remnant of activity in another district. It is unclear whether it signals continuation or repetition. The ambiguity feels intentional or at least unresolved. A subtle detail catches your attention near a wall, layers of repair that stop abruptly unfinished. A footnote from archaeological interpretation suggests that such incomplete maintenance may indicate interrupted civic cycles or shifting priorities, though no agreement has been reached on whether these represent sudden disruption or gradual disengagement. You stand in the center of a quiet passage, surrounded by structures that are still standing, still intact, but no longer fully animated by daily repetition. And you begin to understand that in this forgotten city, the final stage is not destruction. It is attenuation, where life continues, but at a diminishing volume until only traces remain. You leave the quiet, thinning district behind, and the city feels almost suspended now, as if it is caught between presence and absence. The structures are still standing firmly, their mud brick walls intact, their pathways still traceable, yet the rhythm that once animated them has become faint, like a distant echo that refuses to fully disappear. The air is still warm, but it no longer feels busy. It feels settled. Even the wind moves differently here, slipping through empty corridors and open doorways without interruption. Sound is rare now, and when it appears, it feels isolated, as if each noise is happening in its own separate world. You walk through what seems like a familiar residential district, though the familiarity now carries a strange emotional distance. Homes remain upright, courtyards remain defined, but the density of life has softened significantly. A few scattered signs of use persist: a partially swept floor, a container left near a wall, a faint impression of recent passage that has not yet been erased. Records confirm that in many ancient urban environments, the final phases of habitation often involved gradual environmental reclamation, where vegetation began to reappear in spaces once dominated by human activity. Yet oddly enough, archaeological layers sometimes show continued intermittent use of structures, even after apparent decline, leading scholars still to debate whether abandonment was absolute or cyclical in nature. You notice small patches of green beginning to emerge between compacted earth and cracked surfaces. Not full growth, but suggestion. The city is slowly allowing nature to return, not as an invasion, but as a quiet negotiation. A curious footnote from excavation findings suggests that some settlements show evidence of repeated reoccupation phases after periods of decline, indicating that urban spaces were sometimes returned to after long absences. However, no agreement has been reached on whether this reflects seasonal migration, environmental recovery cycles, or long-term cultural attachment to place. You continue walking, aware that the city now feels like a memory layered onto itself. The physical structures remain, but their function has loosened. Walls no longer define activity, only space. Records confirm that environmental processes in abandoned or partially abandoned urban sites often accelerate structural decay, especially in mud brick architecture exposed to seasonal weather cycles. Yet, oddly enough, some structures persist far longer than expected, leading scholars still to argue whether preservation is due to construction techniques, environmental conditions, or sheer chance. You pass through a wider open area that once felt central. Now it is quiet, almost contemplative in its stillness. The ground here is uneven, marked by time rather than movement. No single activity defines the space anymore. Instead, it holds traces of many overlapping histories. A faint detail catches your attention near the edge of the square, scattered fragments of pottery and stone partially embedded into soil. A footnote from archaeological interpretation suggests that such deposits often represent long-term accumulation rather than sudden abandonment, though no agreement has been reached on whether they reflect ritual closure, gradual disposal, or natural collapse over time. You pause for a moment, letting the stillness settle around you. The city is no longer active in the way you first encountered it. It is not fully gone either. It exists in a state of lingering presence where structure remains, but rhythm has faded, and memory is slowly becoming indistinguishable from material. And you begin to understand that in this forgotten city, the final truth is not disappearance, but transformation into landscape where human life becomes part of the earth it once shaped. You remain standing in the quiet remnants of the city, and for a long moment, nothing seems to move at all. The air is still but not empty. It carries layers of everything you have passed through, as if the entire settlement is now speaking only in memory rather than motion. The structures around you are no longer active in any immediate sense. Walls stand without purpose. Pathways exist without direction. Courtyards hold space without gathering. Yet nothing feels truly erased. Instead, everything feels absorbed into a slower form of existence, where time is no longer measured by daily rhythm, but by gradual change. You walk gently forward, noticing how the city has become part of the landscape in a more complete way. Dust settles into corners that once carried footsteps. Small plants grow where movement once compressed the earth. Light falls across surfaces without interruption, no longer shaped by constant human passage. Records confirm that many ancient urban sites eventually transitioned into what archaeologists describe as settled abandonment, where structures remain visible but are no longer actively maintained or continuously inhabited. Yet oddly enough, some sites show traces of symbolic return long after decline, suggesting that memory and meaning may persist beyond physical occupation. Scholars still argue whether such returns represent continuity of culture or retrospective reinterpretation by later groups. You pause near what may have once been a central gathering place. It is difficult now to separate function from form. The space is still clearly defined, but its purpose feels softened, redistributed into silence. You can almost imagine the overlapping layers of activity that once filled it, but they no longer exist in sound, only in impression. A curious footnote from archaeological findings suggests that in some ancient cities, later generations built small markers or structures within abandoned urban spaces, possibly as commemorations or reinterpretations of earlier settlement life. Though no agreement has been reached on whether these acts were reverence, reuse, or simple practicality. You take a final slow look around. The city is no longer unfolding before you. It is resting, not ended, but settled into another state of being where human intention has become part of the ground itself, indistinguishable from earth dust and time. Records confirm that understanding ancient urban life often requires reading absence as carefully as presence, interpreting silence as part of the historical record rather than its negation. Yet, oddly enough, this silence is never truly empty. It is filled with traces, echoes, and structural memory that continue to shape interpretation today. And as you begin to step back from the city's final open space, the sense remains that you are not leaving something destroyed, but something transformed, a place where life once gathered in full complexity and has now become part of a deeper, slower landscape. The world beyond feels closer again as you turn away. The boundaries between past and present begin to reassert themselves gently without urgency, and you carry with you the understanding that this forgotten city was never truly lost in a single moment. It simply fanned into time until it became part of the long-felt foundation upon which later worlds would stand. Now, as everything settles, there is nothing left to follow but stillness. A slow breath of silence remains, and it stays with you even as you let the story fade. Sweet dreams.